Welcome, everybody, to the Intellectual Diversity Podcast. I'm John Tangney, and my guest today is Dr. Kirk Meighoo, who is the author of Politics in a Half-Made Society, a former senator from Trinidad and Tobago, and is currently the presenter of the Independent Life and Thought podcast, which is a podcast discussing global political issues. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's independent thought and freedom, though. But
sorry. Yeah.
That's not a problem.
Okay, so I mean, the reason I was interested in having you on the podcast was that I gleaned from our various online conversations that you've been on a political odyssey over the past few decades, and
yes.
I'm interested in political conversion experiences and how people, change their values over time. And one of the things we first encountered each other in a Facebook group, and you made reference to Donald Trump and to addressing Donald Trump supporters in your podcast, and I immediately assumed you were somebody who was going to start talking down to them, or trying to convert them from the error of their ways, because that's something I encounter a lot in various contexts in the academic world. And then we discovered after a short conversation that we were both, somewhat tolerant of Donald Trump.
Yeah, I even more so. I would say much more than tolerant.
yeah. Or that we liked him in some ways, and and we found some areas of disagreement too. So I'd like to begin by asking you about the New World Group. You mentioned that you consider yourself a member of that, and it's something that I think people listening in my circle of acquaintance possibly don't know a lot about. Can you tell me what that is?
Sure, yeah. And I mean, even in the Caribbean, sadly, most people don't know what it's about, although they might know the individual members. But basically, the Caribbean was moving, the English-speaking Caribbean was moving towards independence in the late 50s and early 60s. And so the first countries that got independence were Jamaica and Trinidad in 1962, but there was a federation in 58. And we had opened up our university, which was a subsidiary of the University of London, became independent in 58 as part of the federation. We were supposed to be a federation of the West Indies. And it's interesting, when Jamaica got independence in 62, it was as a result of a referendum where the Jamaicans did not want to be part of a West Indian federation. So they pulled out, and that among the regional intellectuals at the University of the West Indies, for short we call it UWI, UWI. So the UWI intellectuals were very disturbed by it, because they were excited by the sort of the creation of the regional country, and in fact CLR James, which I don't know if your listeners would be acquainted with him, but his two most famous books are The Black Jacobins, written in 1938, and which is the definitive biography of Toussaint Louverture to this day, brilliant book, and Beyond the Boundary, which is a book about cricket and colonialism and empire and decolonization and hybrid identity. It's an amazing book. But CLR James was spending a lot of time in the West Indies, because he was in London, he was in the States and stuff. But during the Federation period, he inspired a bunch of young students. And so while all this stuff was going on and the regional project was disintegrating for individual island independence, and then people were wondering what type of independence are these leaders taking the country into. So some young radical lecturers and some graduate students formed their own group to think about West Indian independence very differently from what was unfolding in the official process. And it was a region-wide movement from Guyana and the South American continent, which is considered Caribbean because its sociology and history is more Caribbean than Latin American. Plantation, coastal, etc. Ethnically and historically, etc. So from Guyana right up to Jamaica, and then even Montreal had a significant grouping there. Toronto had somewhat. I'm not sure if New York did, or London, but certainly there were strong links to New York and London as well. And so they had a journal. So you had the New World Journal, which was published out of the Mona campus in Jamaica. You had a New World Fortnightly, which came out of Guyana. And you were getting all these organs, and it was very, very groundbreaking and very nationalist in a way, right? But it's weird because they were sort of against island nationalism, right? It's not that they didn't like the small island nationalism, but they were West Indian nationalists, let's put it that way. And it's not that they wanted to erase the island identities either. But I suppose it might be something like what some people might be arguing in Europe. You keep the national identities, the larger regional identities. So it might be something like that. And yeah, so you had the group coming up in the 60s, and there was all the ferment all around the world. It was because then you had the Paris '68, you had the civil rights movement in the States, and Vietnam War going on. Cuba, the Cuban Revolution was new, right? In '58, right? Castro came to power, so that had an effect. Jamaica's right next to Cuba, and so there were a lot of fissures inside the group. But Lloyd Best, who was the intellectual leader of the group, he had a seminal essay he wrote called "Independent Thought and Caribbean Freedom," and so my podcast takes from that. And I worked with Lloyd for many years from the 90s. But so in the 60s, I think 65, he wrote Independent Thought and Caribbean Freedom. And basically it was like a manifesto saying we're not going to be part of the Cold War thing, capitalism and socialism and the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. We need to analyze our own problems in our own way, develop a language, develop a lexicon, develop theories, etc., based on our unique experience in the West Indies. And the importance of the West Indian experience is that C.L.R. James has argued this for a long time, that the West Indies were the birth of the modern world system. Right, so that's where you had Europe coming into the colonies, bringing in African labor to work on plantations, which were proto-industries, right? Whereas before you had kind of cottage industries in Europe and elsewhere. On the plantation, people were organized for the first time on an industrial scale. They produced commodities for global export. They did not produce for themselves. They imported everything from the food to the clothes to the labor force. And the Caribbean presaged the modern world. And in fact, it became part of the modern world before much of Europe did. And it sort of was there. And we also represented the dark side of modernity and the underbelly of modernity and the ugliness of global capitalism. The first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Eric Williams, was also a great intellectual. He wrote Capitalism and Slavery. And that was about how it really shook up the historiography of the anti-slavery movement and colonial historiography by saying that the abolitionist movement was not a humanitarian movement primarily, but it was driven by developments in global capitalism, and that wage labor was in fact better for capitalism than slave labor, and it was really a battle between the new forms of capitalism that were emerging and the old feudal slave-based forms. So we've had these debates going on for that was written in 1944, Capitalism and Slavery. So, and very interestingly, one would have thought that he would have been a radical leader. And in fact, when he came to power in '62, he cracked down on the trade union movement. He was, very dictatorial, you could say, in a lot of ways. It wasn't a dictatorship, but he's a very autocratic leader. He was in power until his death for 30 years, and he disappointed so many people. It's a very interesting relationship because they looked up to him, the intellectuals, but then he disappointed them so much, and there were rebellions, strong rebellions against him. There was even a huge sort of island-wide series of protests from 1968 to 72. There was a state of emergency. The army mutinied because the young people were calling the government that Williams put in place a neo-colonial government. That we were independent in name, but we were still basically colonies. So the New World Group came out of that. But then as all these things were coming up in the 60s, a faction became much more Marxist, became much more allied to the Cuban Revolution, became much more allied even to the Soviet Union. There was a small little faction, but influential, and they eventually influenced the Grenadian Revolution that happened in '79, and then which led to the American invasion in '83, after Maurice Bishop was killed. And then you had Lloyd Best, who he in fact, interesting, was the first one to leave the New World Group, because when he returned to Trinidad, the leader of the New World Group here became very socialist and became sort of allied with the Soviet movement, the international movement for communism. And so Lloyd Best declared he's leaving New World, and he formed his own group called the Tapia House Movement, which is based on the idea of a tapia house, which is houses made of mud on earth. So he's talking about building from the ground up, building organically, and this sort of thing. So you had so it splintered. It splintered, in other words. So you had people in all these different tendencies, and the New World Group splintered. But I personally, and there was a group in Jamaica. Some went very sort of hardcore communists, and others were with Michael Manley. I don't know if you know about Michael Manley's democratic socialist experiment in Jamaica in the 70s, and the CIA destabilization, which was very important. And Bob Marley used to sort of he was caught up in a lot of that because it was in the 70s. But yeah, so a lot of the New World Group people ended up in the Manley administration, and I ended up doing my master's with a lot of those Jamaican New World people who were with the Manley administration. That was in the 90s, early 90s. And so I was, and I knew about the whole historical thing. So I was really excited when I got into grad school with these people. It was like in heaven, with all these people who I was reading about all the time. And then later on, when I went back to Trinidad, I started working with Lloyd Best. And so I was working with these in fact, one of the people from Montreal who was very much involved in the New World Group movement, she's Carl Polanyi's daughter, the famous Great Transformation, Carl Polanyi, and so her name was Carrie Polanyi Levitt, and that was her married name. And she was very, 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 very close to the New World Group, but she kind of moved off into the kind of left-wing faction. Not communist, but the left-wing Manley sort of faction. And but anyway, but she taught me economics and Norman Gervin, and so I was involved in different factions of the New World Group, although they had broken up by the 70s, and I'm talking 90s. But they had been continuing doing their own things. Some doing their own journals, like that's what Lloyd was doing. He was doing his journals, and I became a contributing editor to the journal and worked in his institute called the Trinidad and Tobago Institute of the West Indies. I was an honorary fellow there. And but I kept in touch with the people in Jamaica, and the people in Jamaica had the Consortia Graduate School at the university, and that's where I did my master's. And so although it's not around any longer, I'm very much inspired by it, and my whole mindset is informed by it, and I fundamentally believe in their tenets about thinking independently, acting independently, not getting caught up in the global rivalries because they don't really care about us or know about us. And yet we're used as pawns in games, and people are willingly being used as pawns, and sometimes, joyously, because, somehow they feel that's how you get involved in, the international scene. But as people like C.L.R. James or V.S. Naipaul or Lloyd Best said, we have our contributions autonomously to make to global civilization, which we have done and we should continue to do autonomously and be true explicit partners in global consciousness, discourse, movements, etc., etc. And I certainly hold by that, and I'm so glad that I'm able to use this podcast to kind of forward that, because since Lloyd Best died in 2005, I've been doing my own things, and I myself have kind of drifted apart from the other people in the who worked at the Institute, and so I'm just glad to now have a chance to put my own interpretation on it, which I feel is faithful.
I see. Yeah, these cultural nationalist moments, such as you describe, surrounding the original New World group, seem to be situations where being an intellectual is very consequential, and being a leftist in that period, being a leftist intellectual, also seems to be very exciting and consequential. And the development of the left in the subsequent decades in Europe and America was away from class politics towards identity politics, and many people who are disaffected from the left now would see this as a process of the left becoming decadent in some way, and maybe losing its credibility. And I wonder if you feel that the same thing happened to the New World group, or did it transform in a different way?
Actually, I forgot to mention that, because that's an important point. Because another pressure or split that came was not only from the Cold War and the communists and capitalists, but it was the Black consciousness movement. And so a lot of people in the New World became very pro-Black, right? And very much into the Garveyite African consciousness sort of thing. And Lloyd Best, although he was very sympathetic to that, and he was a proud Black man and proud of his heritage and so forth, he didn't fully embrace the agenda, and like C.L.R. James, who argued that we were a fundamentally Western people as well. I mean, he talked about similar to what W.E.B. Du Bois did in the States about dual consciousness, and that we, especially in the West Indies, we have these Creole cultures and hybrid cultures, and we're in a state of in-betweenity. So you have all these tensions going on. And I mean, the difference between the identity politics that would occur in the West Indies and that which occurs in the US and European thing is that in the US and European thing, it's sort of like it's about others, right? So you're trying to protect others, and it's almost, and I can tell you a story about my whole experience with the international development movement, because that's part of my studies, and I sort of had that consciousness for a while, being around mainly white Canadian developmental people, and they wanted to save the world and get involved in El Salvador, and and I was all into that, the FMLN and Sandinistas, and then I had my own epiphany, and it's a very different thing. The identity politics in the West Indies and the Garveyite consciousness, the African consciousness, is about yourself, not about other people, not trying to protect, trying to look for a new thing to assuage your guilty conscience or whatever it is. It's about yourself, that wow, I've been internally colonized, and now the scales have dropped from my eyes, and it's a totally different thing. In fact, the alt-right today is closer to the Garveyite consciousness, because the alt-right today are sort of looking at their own selves. I mean, you could agree or disagree with the whole white genocide meme or whatever it is, but it's the same type of thing. People are, oh, and that if you put up a sign, it's okay to be white, people are attacking you and saying that's racism.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait, what's going on? So actually, the type of identity politics that was developing in the West Indies and with the New World Group was similar to an alt-right thing. But the difference with the alt-right is that it is a consciousness of white people, let's say in Europe and America, which are dominant countries, and so our consciousness in the West Indies would be of colonial people who are getting culturally aware and nationalistic and whatnot. So it does ally with the whole anti-colonial. There are these differences and interesting contradictions, you might want to put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about the identity political left is that they tend to denounce any essentializing impulses in other people, particularly if they're white. And the reason they don't like the alt-right is because they do tend to essentialize whiteness and to promote things like ethno-nationalism. And
yet they argue for diversity. So, so you need more. You need more racial diversity, but there's no such thing as race.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, there's some contradictions in there that I've never fully got my head around.
They haven't either. I'm certain.
Yeah. So yeah, it's like race is a cultural construct, except when you need to be strategically essentialist, as everybody needs to be when they're talking to somebody above them on the victimhood totem pole. But when they're talking to somebody below them, they have to acknowledge the socially constructed nature of whatever identity they have.
And to me, it's a perverse way of asserting one's dominance.
Yeah,
okay? Because I am so I have white privilege, or I'm so dominant. I should not have the right to assert my identity. But you poor oppressed people, you are allowed your little quaint ethnicities. But we have transcended it. We know there's no such thing as race, but you all are too stupid to know that there's no such thing as race. So you can have your race, and we'll protect you. It's just I really can't stand the whole patronizing thing, and I went through it all in the whole international development sphere, because that was my training. I mean, I'd like to just tie that in, because in the 80s, right, when I was at the University of Toronto, and I was doing international development studies, and it was a small little group, and so everybody felt special and selected, and I was actually, and it was very interesting. It was about development in the third world, and I was like one of the few. I think there was a Vietnamese guy, and so in the small little group, and me, and the rest of the people were white, and various types of Canadians, I guess some of German background or British or Irish or whatever, but in Canada it's just white. People didn't really make those types of distinctions so much, but so and at the Scarborough campus where we were and where our program was, there were a lot of Indians and not so many black people, but there were a lot. And I think even if you compared it to the downtown campus, ours had a lot of ethnic minorities or whatever. Yet in this program about the third world, it was dominantly white, and I just thought that was a glaring contradiction. So here's this program to help third world countries, and we have a very third world population on campus, but they have nothing to do with these people. In fact, most of those third world people didn't like the kind of hippies that were in the international development movement. So that was one contradiction I saw, and I found very interesting, because I had friends. In fact, I was more friends with the people that were critical of the other people in my program, and I became very critical later on, right? Because I had a kind of Malcolm X epiphany at some point. But at the beginning I was like totally like that sort of white savior complex thing, you know. I want to go to El Salvador and work with the FMLN and, you know, and bring about the socialist revolution and all this kind of stuff. And that was, because we had to do a 1-year placement in a third world country. And so that was my goal. I wanted to go with the FMLN. Because the Sandinistas, they won already, but El Salvador was still going on. And right, so you had this thing going on. And then the other thing was, so this was around this time you were having like the what is it? Do They Know It's Christmas? Live Aid. No, Band Aid. It was Band Aid, and then the Amnesty International concerts, and you had all these things going on, right? And so you had that kind of movement with all these celebrities being, you know, and that when you look back at that song, Do They Know It's Christmas? It's almost like a parody, right? I mean, it's like a racist parody of itself, you know. Nothing grows in Africa, and Do They Know It's Christmas? And you know, the only gift they'll get this year is life. And it's like, it's amazing. I just think it's just so hilarious. It's like over the top. You can't believe that people were serious. So, but you had this idea, because a lot of the people in my international development studies course, which I found strange. There was like this clique, right? This kind of little Anglo-Irish. Well, like you get a lot of those in Toronto, right? But it's like these kind of. So what I realized, it was the Anglican Church, right? Because then I remember the new head of our program. I don't know if she was a nun or not, like an ex-nun, but there was something I think called Primus Inter Pares, or it could have been Primates, or I don't know, something like that. But it was actually like involved with the Anglican Church, and I didn't realize that. So a lot of these people had done stuff through the Anglican Church. It was probably some, you know, transformation of what used to be missionary music, missionary work, and transformed to development work, right? But the sort of legacy would have been from that missionary impulse.
That's
and
very interesting,
yeah, you know, and I was trying to figure it out at the time. I couldn't figure it out, and they had this bond, and it was like kind of strange to me, and I didn't get it, and but then I kind of realized, oh, you went on this thing, and they had some summer programs where they would go away, and they knew each other from that, and so, but it's like they focus so much on NGOs, right? So whether it be the African, you know, even Amnesty International, so they focus so much on NGOs. I was in university there, learning about development and ecology and political economy and whatever, and all this stuff. And it's like we never talked about third world politics. Like, you know, it was as if governments didn't exist. It's like as if all development work was through NGOs. So like an NGO could just walk into a country and just go wherever they want and do whatever they want, because it was profoundly disrespectful to the governments that these people had. It's like as if Ethiopia didn't have a government, as if Kenya didn't have a government, as if, you know, Thailand didn't have a government. You just totally ignored it. So you know, we studied their ecology and we studied their culture or whatever, their history and political economy and poverty and whatever, but not about politics. You never spoke about politics. And when I had my sort of nationalist revelation, which is something else, and everything changed in me, and I decided to go back to Trinidad. But I became so political, and then I realized how everything has to do with politics. But like these, and there was resistance for me to go back to my own country, to my own ancestral country to do work. They wanted me to go to another country, and I just found that amazing. It's a weird mentality, right?
What was the rationale for wanting you to go to another country?
they never told me exactly, because I went no matter what, right? But there was some resistance, and what I was told, and there's probably, you know, some good reason behind it, that, you know, when you go back to your own background, there all sorts of complications occur, right? I don't know. I guess you couldn't get involved in political stuff, family stuff. I don't know, but there are other complications that occur when you go back to your own setting, right? And so I guess they thought you would get too involved or something. Yeah, the objection they eventually gave to me was something about that the NGO I had chosen to work with. Yeah, because we had to work with an NGO. You couldn't work with the government, you had to work with an NGO. And the NGO that I chose, they said wasn't development focused enough, right? It was too much with like education or whatever. It was working with unemployed, out of school youth. And so they had some objection that it didn't fit into the development paradigm or whatever. And but I think that was tied to the objection that I was going to Trinidad itself. But I made my case and my argument against them, and I prevailed. And so I went. Yeah, but it's very interesting, because then when I did my master's in development studies, right? So this was my my BSc in or BA in international development studies, right? And then my master's in development studies was now in Jamaica at the University of the West Indies. And this now was totally political, right? Because all these people were like, I mean, most of these people, they were involved, they're like burned out revolutionaries, right? So they were all involved in some government or some Marxist movement or some New World thing in the 70s. And most of because by this time, right, this was 92. So the whole thing that all the left-wing people felt when the Cold War, I mean, when the Berlin Wall fell and everybody was confused and they didn't know what they did for the past 20 years, and is capitalism really the right thing? And some people became like, you know, from communists to now big time neoliberals and all this kind of stuff. So you had all that going on, but everybody was like totally political. And so it's a very, very, very different way, because, and again, it has to do with, one is like dealing with the other. And in Jamaica, you're dealing with yourself, right? And this is one thing I always have felt about, you know, left-wing activists in, you know, Europe, Canada, America. You know, it's like a fad. It's like, you know, it's like vegetarianism, or, you know, or, yeah, you know, it's like, for, you know, this year you're into organic stuff, and then you're into like saving whales, and then you're into like animal rights for a couple of years, and then you're into saving the third world for a couple of years, and then you're into, and then you get a job and your family and whatever, and you know, that's all, you know, and you know, so it's like a little, it's some sort of identity crisis thing, or some passing thing in your youth. But for us in the third world, this is our life. It's life or death stuff. It's not some little fad you guys are interested in and not serious about. Right? And I have this fundamental objection. And I mean, V.S. Naipaul, our great writer, intellectual. I mean, he developed a criticism of white liberals, you know, from the 50s and 60s. And I mean, his archetype, I would call it, of Gail Benson in his novel Gorillas, is I'm trying to remember. There's a contemporary term that people use. Well, yeah, virtue signaling. Basically, he was talking about, before the term virtue signaling came about. He noticed that, like you know, about all the kind of white British either missionaries or colonial office employees that worked in like Kenya, or you know, or those kind of New York radicals that embraced the Black Panthers, or like John Lennon when he embraced Michael X and went to Trinidad. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, virtue signaling has been part of the Protestant tradition since it began, I would think. And
yeah,
you know, something that you mentioned a while ago about the Anglican ethos of some of the virtue signaling Canadians in your program in Toronto. was interesting to me because it's become commonplace now to trace the virtue signaling activities of American liberals back to their own Puritan tradition, and these are, of course, different parts of the different kind of schismatic elements of the Reformation. And you were also talking about the schismatic activities within the leftist tradition that emerged from the New World group after the 1960s. So there's something about the combination of Protestantism and philosophical materialism that lends itself to both being schismatic and to being into virtue signaling and self-righteousness. But
yeah,
I do think that the particular way in which virtue signaling operates in university liberal communities has changed a bit since the 1980s, because you were talking about these predominantly white hippies talking down to people from the third world back in the 80s, and I would think that in equivalent programs today you'd find relatively few white people and a lot of people whose provenance is originally in the third world who are now quite privileged members of first world societies who are still kind of hanging on to their victimhood capital. Like when I was in graduate school, it wasn't that white people were going around talking down and, exercising power by admitting to their white privilege. They were actually scared, and they were like going around apologizing for their existence because it was the members of minorities within American societies who had the power and who had weaponized their victimhood and were using it for all they were worth.
Yeah, I was fascinated by your discussion with Michael Rechtenwald about that. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was like listening to something like from the Soviet Union, I mean, yeah, it really has. It really has changed since then. In the fact that this sort of, I guess, privileged minorities, if you want to put it that way, have taken. I think they've taken the sort of lead in this sort of, I don't know if I want to call it the mob part of it, because the Antifa aspect, to me, Antifa still looks to me, because I'm only looking at it from abroad. I'd love to go do some participant, because I was also an anthropologist trained in anthropology. I'd love to do some participant observation among Antifa, but I know from the 80s, because I was involved very much in a lot of the anarchist movement of that time, that I think is a direct antecedent of Antifa. So I have a lot of insight into those guys, but the Antifa movement still seems basically white. I think BLM, they have aligned with BLM, and BLM is different, right? So but to me it seems like the Antifa is still kind of privileged whites in alliance with BLM, which is autonomously organized, but then you do kind of have a kind of Latino element, I think, in the Antifa thing, especially, when they're, so I think maybe you might have more Latinos than African Americans in Antifa, maybe, but I think the Antifa is still, like the bike lock professor who,
Locrates.
Yeah, and I didn't hear that one. That's a good one. So like, although, I know one of the one of the leaders in that's interviewed on Fox, and she's kind of a real nutcase, and she has these classmates. She I think she's like Mexican and Filipina or something, kind of mix. I can't remember her name, but she's like hardcore communist or whatever. But but you're right. There is that difference, that is it, and the way that white people are on defensive, did not exist in the 80s, and I mean it sounds so scary from your conversation. I mean, it's like, oh my God. Now, I mean, and I always want, because in the 80s and early 90s, I was kind of like part of that, in a sense, that sort of black nationalist thing. I used to have this Malcolm X shirt that I made, a cover of one of his books called The End of White World Supremacy, and I had it on there, and I just love to shock people with it. But it's but it's not that. But there's something different about my motivation then, and what I'm detecting now, because it is such a resentment. You know, it's a almost a pure manifestation of what Nietzsche talks about in the genealogy of morality, about the resentment, the resentment morality. It's like it's like the best, truest manifestation of that is in existence today in this very movement.
I mean, you back in the 1980s, you were relatively close to the period in which your country had been subject to an imperial power, and those kinds of post-imperialist politics were still very real. But I think what's happened now is that victimhood has become the most valuable form of cultural capital in liberal society, and and people have built their careers on their association with some kind of imperial colonial suffering in the past, and even though they have very little actual real life connection to it anymore, and they're protecting that social capital for all they're worth.
Exactly, because I have a special contempt for those type of people too, because like these sort of immigrant leftists, right, in these countries. Like, for instance, I find it very very insulting when it's like they have no loyalties to anything, right? They don't have loyalty to the countries they came from because they don't want to go back, right? And they don't have loyalty to the country they've migrated to. They have no loyalty whatsoever. And when and when, for instance, when deportation is seen as like execution, right? Like going back to your country of origin is like the worst thing in the world. Or like, if someone were to, yell at immigrant, why don't you go back where you came from? Well, what's wrong with where you came from? Right? I went back to where I came from. What's wrong with Jamaica? What's wrong with Trinidad? What's wrong with it? Right? So people got mad at Trump allegedly calling these countries. I don't want to put the parental advisory thing on you on your podcast. I won't say it, but but they're angry at him for saying it. But they acted because they will fight tooth and nail to prevent someone going to Mexico. I think Mexico is a great country. I love Mexico. I think it's an amazing, fascinating country. And I was so surprised the first time I went, because like when I went to Tijuana, I was expecting some sort of degraded place with American tourists, and they had, that they were just catering for U.S. tourists and college students getting drunk, and there'd be prostitution and no sort of national life, but no, I was totally impressed by their sense of selfhood and their pride and their autonomous life and how different it was from San Diego, although it's just across, just walking. You walk between San Diego and
I mean, the argument is that these are people with limited economic opportunities in their own countries, and that's somehow indirectly the fault of these very rich countries, and that therefore we should promote the gradual intermingling of all these countries until we're one.
But I'll give you a story. I had the honor of launching my book in the UK House of Commons in 2003, and so I mean a lot of my associates and friends, would have been in the UK, these immigrant left-wing people who I'm talking about. And I mean, they obviously recognized it as an honor, for that to happen, but it didn't sit with them well, and they were like, well, don't you find it like so British, in the I said, of course, and that's why I love it, right? I mean, I want Britain to hold on to its British past and whatnot, just like I want Trinidad to hold on to its past, and they were like, confused because they don't want to go back to their own countries. They don't, right? And yet they hate the country they're in, and I think that's a terrible existence. What sort of psychic state are you in? I mean, you have no loyalty to anything, and I think, and I've come to develop the strong view that loyalty and being part of a group is essential to being human, to being fully human. That is the only way you get to express some of the core human virtues, such as loyalty, courage, honor. It is in relation to the group. And if you have no group, and these left-wing voluntary groups are no real groups. A group is like blood in, blood out. Kind of, you can't. It's like your family or whatever. You love them, hate them. That's who you're part of. It's not these voluntary associations that you're there for 5 years and then you go to another one and another one. Those aren't real communities or groups. But and this whole liberal ideology, which goes back to the foundation of liberalism, I think, where we are autonomous individuals and everything is free choice, and it is profoundly dehumanizing. It is dehumanizing, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, this points to the strange symbiosis of neoliberalism and the identity political left in universities in particular, but also in Silicon Valley, and the way that by dispensing with class politics and taking up the banner of identity politics, they've made it so that the kinds of conflict that they engage in have very low stakes for the globalists running the world economy, and it doesn't really affect their bottom line if they make concessions about more women in the workplace or about more minorities in the workplace, or allow people to have transgender bathrooms, whereas it makes a big difference to their bottom line if they are constantly having to deal with collective bargaining about wages. And
exactly.
So there is this symbiosis between liberals of a right-wing economic hue and of a left-wing identity political hue.
I mean, it's amazing. On all the gay pride parades, you have leading largest multinationals in the world, sponsoring them. You have the richest, most powerful corporations sponsoring all these SJWs.
And so against this kind of self-interested or this kind of globalization that's really driven by short-sighted self-interest on the parts of a lot of different people pursuing their own personal goals, you're proposing some kind of group identity based in nationalism. And yet the argument against that, coming from thoughtful people on the left, is that for years European states and global states all over the world were in a state of nature with each other, and this led ultimately to cataclysmic wars, and that therefore we need to be promoting some kind of bigger federated union of states all over the world and move past the nationalist moment. And even if there are some unsavory things going on in the way I described in Silicon Valley and the academic world, there is a bigger ideal at stake here that needs to be pursued, past these kinds of grubby mercenary considerations that people are pursuing.
I do see the point you're making, definitely, and I do think Europe's history of nationalism is peculiar, and that the sort of what someone on the alt-right would call fratricidal wars or whatever, but the intra-European wars, I don't think that is sort of reflective of nationalism outside of Europe. I think that that is a very peculiar European experience of nationalism. Well, and I don't know why that is.
You could say that it's characteristic of the relationship between China and Japan.
I suppose, but I don't think they had the sort of centuries of warfare in the same way. Like, okay, you had World War II when Japan had China, and then you had the communists eventually putting them out. But No, it's what, you have that, but not so. I mean, there's tensions, but
Mm.
it's not war. There's that, and I can't recall any which one preceded that. I'm sure there were, but I don't know, the time before that Japan would have invaded. I think
Yeah.
maybe sometime in the 19th century there might have been one.
I mean, I guess it has to do with the level of development that they were at in the 19th century as compared to Europe.
I suppose, but then before, all right, Angus Madison has some
Yeah.
amazing data on the global GDP and broken down by countries. But before the 18th century, uh, China and India, since 0 AD, basically were the leading global economies. Even the early days of European colonialism, like from 1492 when Columbus went at, still they were still below like the Mughal empires and the, I can't remember which the various Chinese empires that would have happened, that would have been there, and the Persians and the Ottomans. So that these countries were leading economies in the world, and I mean that's why Columbus tried to did his voyage in the first place. He was trying to get to these economies. So I mean, so these were the leading economies in the world, and you didn't have the same sort of history of the type of warfare that occurred during those let's say 2 centuries of nationalism. I guess what is the post-Napoleonic period? Because I've been trying to figure this thing out in Europe, and I think that a lot of nationalism is really a reaction to Napoleon, and then trying to reorganize European society, but not necessarily along the old monarchical lines. And so they came up with the nation state idea. That's sort of my reformulating.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we don't have to confine it to nation states. I mean, anywhere where there's a kind of a reified regional identity rubbing up against another one in close geographical proximity to it, there tends to be a history of conflict.
Yeah, there's always border wars. Yeah, I mean that's for sure.
Yeah.
But the kind of world war thing that happened in with the alliance of these powers and those powers, and the Catholics and the Protestants, like in the Reformation, and the Spanish and the French and the English and the Dutch. I don't know. I think it's something peculiarly European, because even in Africa, right? Recently, in the 1990s and 2000s, some people have called it like Africa's World War, like with the split of the Congo. Yeah, that was the closest thing to what happened in Europe, where you'd have like Uganda and Rwanda on one side and Angola, and people would be supporting different factions in in these in the breakup of the Congo and Zaire, and I think there's something, and there's who knows. I think with the breakup of Zaire, maybe, I don't know if it had to do with natural resources and the diamonds and whatever, or just land. I don't know. I think there's something. I think there is something that needs to be explained more in the European situation. I don't think it can be generalized just like that.
Possibly not. My feeling is that it has to do with the level of technological development in European nation states that made their wars more destructive than any wars had been previously, but that any political entities who are in relationship with each other have been having wars since time immemorial, and that therefore, there's a question for us when we're talking about the nationalist ideals of the right and the globalist ideals of the left today, as to whether humanity is making moral progress. Are we becoming better at finding political solutions to these things in any parts of the world or globally? Or should we kind of reconcile ourselves to human nature being always the same, and the reality that, greed and self-interest will always be our primary motivations, and that therefore we need to consolidate our own political identities and make sure that we're protected against, you know, people who might want to take things away from us. And it seems to me that the right has decided that you know, human nature doesn't change. That the left has sometimes unrealistic aspirations towards all of us making some kind of moral progress under their tutelage. But I find myself caught between these two.
Yeah, because one is an ideal that we all aspire to, obviously.
Yeah.
You know, and then you have you know, reality, and we have to deal with that. And I mean, and I think the less characterization of the right in this regard is unfair. Like for instance, you see it in India sometimes, and you see it in, like, even the States. Okay, let's take with the Indian situation. When the BJP, which is the Hindu nationalist party, came into power in the 90s, and then there was a lot of progress done with Pakistan, which the so-called secularist Congress party before hadn't been able to make progress on. And even like Reagan, right, who was, you know, I mean, there was so much progress with Gorbachev in all sorts of nuclear arms limitations treaties and stuff like that. I think that people who are open and confident, I suppose, about their peculiar identities, they can actually broker peace kind of better than people who pretend they have no peculiar identities, because I think they're sort of lying to themselves and lying to others, because to lie to yourself, you also have to lie to others. But I do think that the liberal project is unnatural. I think, and it is very much tied to capitalism. And I've recently come to the conclusion that liberalism and imperialism are not contradictory. Like, so when people have the debate about liberal imperialism, but in fact, liberalism is an ideology of empire. Because let's say economically, for you to have this free trade and stuff, you have to have no borders. Yeah. And there's two ways of having no borders. Force everybody voluntarily giving up their borders, or some big entity telling people you no longer have borders, which is a type of imperial thing. And then for you now as an individual to be free floating, and you can go from here to there, and you don't have to have any loyalty to anybody. You have to have a large territory where you can be this anonymous person that goes from this place to that place. And it always works in big anonymous cities, right? Yeah. It's very hard to be liberal in a small town where everybody knows you since you're a kid, and your family and all that stuff. You have to go to a huge city. You have to have a type of anonymity, right, to be liberal, and you have to have the opportunity to run away as well. So I think there's this symbiosis, and you see this detached individual without any loyalty, which is the liberal ideal, and only loyalty to oneself and one's interests. It's the perfect worker for international capitalism, right?
That's true, yeah.
It's the perfect worker. You have no loyalties to anything except what the next iPhone is, or what the next movie is, or whatever, or you know, whatever they tell you. Yeah. You have and it is a consciousness that is devoid of I would say true spirituality, because everything is just so atomized, right? And so nationalism is always driven by non-material senses of duty and loyalty and love and connection to a past and traditions and non-rational things.
But you're comparing the kind of grim reality of actually practiced neoliberalism to the ideal of nationalism, and in real life nationalistic situations such as in Ireland in the 20th century, you know, these national ideals can be quite repressive and quite restricting and quite unwilling to recognize the variety of types of human being that they are. And
Are you from the Republic or from the northern part?
I'm from the Republic.
Right.
And I agree with what you say about neoliberalism being, an ideal of people who have no loyalty to each other and who are just economic vectors. But there is another aspect of liberalism, and it's the idea that you can be a self-fashioner, and that you can generate, new types of community, and you can generate your own types of meaning, and people have done that. And I mean, the art and literature that has been produced in the liberal period is, in a way, testament to that. And the ways in which certain groups of people have found it easier to express their sexuality, for all that we've been complaining about the way they behave in universities. I think this is on balance a good thing, that we no longer we don't throw people off buildings for being gay in the West in the way that they do in Libya. Yeah. And so I think there are pros and cons to both liberalism and nationalism, and
and I do think that there's a liberal mischaracterization of traditional society, though. Like whenever you look at or read testimonies or histories or even stories, let's say in a rigid feudal society or even Victorian society, there are tons of stories of children, young boys, usually from poor backgrounds, who are plucked out of their circumstances and somehow become great leaders or whatever. And that there's always a recognition that there are upper class twits, like the Monty Python skit, right? That there are people who are in the upper class that really that's all they have to save them, because they are really idiots, and everybody knows that. So I think that there was a lot more fluidity in traditional societies than is often recognized by the liberal caricature of them. But obviously, but obviously the ideas of freedom and self-fashioning is something that people find attractive. But I do think that a lot of people are lost when given too much choice, and they don't know what to do, and they don't, and that if they knew that their father was a tailor and they're going to be a tailor, for a lot of people that would give so much more meaning and solidity to their life, and that there is some kind of balance that we don't want people to be rigid and to suppress their talents either, and all this sort of stuff. So I think there is. I mean, I'm not advocating some old.
I think you point to the fact that liberalism, Marxism, and much of the alt-right have the same philosophical assumption at base, and that's a materialist assumption, and that they're looking for substitutes for religion in consumer activity or in identification with some kind of racial ideal. But it's ultimately meaningless when you believe at bottom that we're all going to die, and it doesn't ultimately mean anything. And
absolutely, because I mean, have you read the book The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom?
No, that's one of those books that I'm ashamed not to have read. But
you must read it. It is such, and I am wondering how many people really read it. Right? I mean, it was a massive book in the 80s, and everybody talked about it. And if they read it, did they really understand what he was saying? Because the most important thing he said in that book, the conclusion of the whole book, he was criticizing, the sort of the same things we're criticizing today, the political correctness and stuff, and but that was just the argument to his conclusion. The conclusion was that when the Western world abandoned the idea of the soul, that was the end of everything. Right? So when it became no longer part of intellectual discourse to speak of the soul, that is when everything was lost, and that the only true alternative to the degradations of capitalism, which to me is the same thing as liberalism. Liberalism and capitalism are the same thing.
Yeah.
And the only true solution to it is to regain the soul. And you see it in people like Genovese. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Eugene Genovese, or
No.
even, he's a great historian of slavery in the United States, was a Marxist, and then became a Catholic, and a sort of, I don't know if you want to call it an apologist, or an apologist of a kind of Southern American political tradition of kind of noblesse oblige, right? And his groundbreaking work on the history of slavery also had to do with the world the slaves created for themselves and the moral universe they created. So it's very interesting. And he took this move from left to right. And then another person who I absolutely love is Alistair McIntyre.
Oh yes, yeah, I have read him. Yeah.
After Virtue is such a profound book for me.
Yeah.
And he also went from Marxist to Thomist, Catholic, and I think it's the same. It's the same thing. And I sort of realized in my leftism too, I always disliked liberals, whether when I was totally on the left, or now I dispense with the left and right. You know, Camille Paglia in the 1990s, she was the one that she really shocked me when she was with her independence sort of stance. And I always felt myself to be independent. I said, oh yeah, of course I'm independent. I don't support the Democrats or the Liberal Party or whatever, the Labour Party. Or, you know, I have my own position. But what it is it's you're either you either support, Bill Clinton or Tony Blair, or you support some Trotskyist or whatever, or you have your own leftist position. But Camille Paglia would say, then she would identify Republicans she liked or people on the right. And it's like, wait, that's supposed to be taboo. Yeah. You're not even supposed to think about that. I remember growing up in Toronto and all these liberal and left-wing circles. A way to sort of kill an argument was that that's so conservative. Sorry. And that just to say it's conservative meant that it was invalid. Yes, and now when I did my PhD at the University of Hull, Noel O'Sullivan was in our department in politics there. And he was kind of like the leading or one of the leading conservative intellectuals there. And I was blown away. This man was so intelligent. I was always told conservatives were idiots and they didn't know anything and you should never take them seriously, and that they were just stupid, selfish people who wanted to destroy the world and they hated everybody and they were just, evil people. And I just couldn't believe it. And I was so angry at my education that there was a whole world of thought that I was barred from because of this inherent liberal bias, and that I just discovered so many things and readings and writings that I had never heard of. All these, and the variety of conservative thought in Europe and elsewhere, and that it was all valid, and these people were incredibly intelligent, and it just angered me for a long time. I could not believe I spent my whole education thinking I was so smart and everything. I was like, oh my God.
I had exactly the same experience. I remember trying to talk about Harold Bloom in my first few weeks of graduate school and being shut down and told that he was the enemy. And I remember Francis Fukuyama being somebody who was always just referred to as this idiot that we define ourselves against. And then, I went and read him and I read his books at this point, and it was just such a joy to discover there was this whole other intellectual world. And Alistair McIntyre was part of that. And even though he was held in greater esteem among my teachers at university, he was still somebody who made it okay to be a conservative Catholic. And I dabbled in Catholicism for a while, but I found that ultimately, Catholicism was something that for me, I felt it made sense in Europe in the Middle Ages. And I definitely, feel Catholic culturally, but you know, in a world where Catholicism and Hinduism and Buddhism and are all in conversation with each other, and their dogmas have been relativized by that conversation. I found actually that the person who brought soul back into the world for me was Carl Jung. And if you want to know, if you want to know how to piss off everybody in a political conversation, whether it's Marxists, liberals, or alt-rightists, just bring up Carl Jung.
Or psychoanalysts. Yeah, no, exactly. And Camille Paglia was the one who turned me on. I didn't really know about him too much, but he's amazing. And Jordan Peterson, interestingly, talked about him quite a bit. I mean, exactly. Now, interestingly, I was raised a Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Catholic schools, and in Toronto we had a lot of Irish people. I think they were mostly probably from Northern Ireland, so there was a lot of IRA jokes we used to be telling and stuff like that. I mean, they were all supporters, and that was interesting because they were all nationalists, right? So they were all Republicans. Right, so I believe they were from the north, right? So they were all Republican supporters, and they were Catholic, obviously, with Catholic school. So it's interesting because I think I would think that you would have you would also have a different idea of nationalism than, say, the standard Protestant lefties in England and America. But I was always curious how the South viewed that struggle in the North. But certainly the discussion of nationalism, you would have a very interesting take on that.
We certainly had a different view of nationalism in the South. We were appalled by the things that the IRA was doing on our behalf in Britain. Most of us were. I mean, the IRA had a slightly more sympathetic audience in working class communities in Ireland, because I think the things they were doing became bound up with resentment about poverty and
what about religion? Were the working class in the South, are they fiercely religious or faithful to the church? Let me put it that way.
Everybody was in the 1980s. I mean,
right.
Of any class. The Catholic Church fell apart very quickly in the 1990s. Ireland became liberal extremely quickly, and going back to what we were talking about as regards liberalism and how it doesn't feed the soul. I mean, this was very much the Irish experience. Sorry, I'm just going to take a sip of water.
Yeah, no problem.
This was very much the Irish experience. We gave ourselves over. We went from being a country where nearly everybody went to mass every Sunday to being a country totally given over to consumerism and conspicuous consumption, and the rate of alcoholism soared. Various types of mental illness and suicide became more prevalent, and I think.
How does that tie to the crash in 2008? I think there has to be a tie.
Yeah, I actually think that a lot of people felt relieved after the crash. I mean, there was a lot of hysteria about it, and I remember some of the hysteria. Like, there's a kind of a muckraking journalist called Joe Duffy on Irish radio who interviews people about various issues, and I remember him talking to somebody who was complaining on the radio about how much she was suffering from the crash. And he said, but what about the basics, Mary? Are you going on any holidays this year? And this was the kind of expectations that people had for themselves as a result of the so-called Celtic Tiger economy.
Right, yes. And also, didn't you guys sort of take a harsher role to the banks and bailouts than, let's say, England and America? I sort of remember that. Am I wrong?
No, we were pretty compliant with the banks and with the.
So you guys weren't like Icelandic in that sense. Iceland took a pretty harsh.
No, I mean we basically did what we were told. Our politicians basically, accepted the situation and imposed austerity on us for a number of years. But
I was ready to make an argument about repentance and penance and all that kind of stuff, but maybe not.
No, I mean, but I do think a lot of ordinary people were kind of relieved as the consumer frenzy died down and felt that the country became a saner place. Yeah. So I don't know, and you know, Sinn Féin, who was the parliamentary wing of the IRA, or the political wing of the IRA, I should say, back in the 1980s, is now a parliamentary party in Ireland, and you know, is doing quite well as one of the bigger parties in the country. So
Yeah.
it's
And you know, to bring it back to the sort of questions with the sort of American situation, the alt-right, and I think that you see, there's something I notice that's been going on in the discourse in America in particular. I don't know if it's happening in England or Europe, but the word brown is becoming a big, and instead of black, it's brown.
Yeah.
And I find that very revealing, because what is brown? Brown is nothing. What country does brown come from?
Yeah.
What past does brown have? What history does brown have? Who, you know, what is the story of brown? Right? There is a story of black. There's a story of Mexican. There's a story of, you know, German or whatever. But brown, what is brown? Brown is the perfect consumer. Brown is nothing. You have no past. You have no. You have nothing except you know, you have no group. You have no loyalties. You have you have nothing except, you know, the next Star Wars movie or whatever Netflix has next, or the iPhone or whatever. And it's like the perfect contentless human being, you know, and that's what you know, that's what this whole sort of multi-culti kind of thing is leading to, right? So nobody has any identities anymore. You're brown.
I think that's true. I recall, I forget which comedian who was clearly a liberal, suggesting that we should all just fuck each other until we're all brown.
Yeah.
And I do think that is the liberal ideal. I had never thought of it like that before, but you're right. But you know, this leads me to our disagreement the other day on Facebook about the alt-right, and you know, you were suggesting that their ethno-nationalist ideals were something of a red herring, and that what they really wanted was a return in America to pre-1968 demographics. And you know, I kind of didn't see a meaningful difference between these two things in terms of how you would bring them about, and you disagreed with me, and I'm just wondering what you want to say about that. Or?
Well, the 65 date is important, because that is the date that of the legislation of the Immigration Act in America, where the immigration rules were changed, and it opened up America to basically unrestricted immigration. Maybe there were other things after. I haven't studied it in depth to know the whole legislative history, but I know that everybody points to the 65 Act. So that's what I meant. And I have heard people on the alt-right talk about going back to pre-65 levels. And basically what I was saying is that the ethno-state, as it is caricatured by critics, is seen as this kind of fantasy of a 100% white state, which can lead to the same, you know, European fratricidal wars and whatever, because people are always going to find ways to divide themselves, because you could be 100% white, and then the Eastern Europeans and the Western Europeans, or the Protestants and the Catholics, or whatever it is. You'll always find a way to create groups, because it's human. We need, I believe, you know, it goes back to the time when we were in bands, right? I mean, as an anthropologist, you know, we study these things, and you know, a human band was about 100 people, and that's why we remember 100 people face to face. Our brains is basically that, and this is one thing I love about living in a small society, a small island in the Caribbean. We live in human societies. We're not numbers. Everybody knows everybody else. You can't hide. So you're a human being. You're not a number. You're not a statistic or whatever. And the ancient Greek city-states were, you know, 20,000, 50,000 people. That's how democracy worked. It was face to face. When you debated somebody, you knew them. You weren't debating an abstract ideal, and therefore, you know, when you know somebody, the debate is different from when you don't know somebody.
Yeah.
And so and democracy is about talking, and so it's very, very, very important. You know, these face-to-face small, what I call human scale societies. When you start to get to these mega global capitalist cities that aren't even part of their countries anymore, like London.
Mm-hmm.
London is not England, right? I mean, when I got my scholarship to study in Hull instead of London, right? Hull is, and most people in England have never been in Hull, and I was like, oh my God, why am I going to Hull? And, you know, I had no desire to go to England at the time at all, and I said, at least they could have had me in London, but Hull,
Yeah.
oh my God, I loved it. I got to know England, and I couldn't believe how much I loved it when I was there. I was very surprised, and I was so glad I wasn't in London, because I would have just fallen into the whole immigrant circle and all that kind of stuff. I was glad I didn't fall into that. And so these small face-to-face band societies. I went off on so many tangents. I forgot why I mentioned the
we were talking about pre-65 demographics.
Yes,
versus
right,
the
and
state.
And the ethno-state and all that, and people dividing themselves up. Yeah. And that basically, I mean, Ann Coulter, you know, had been writing about this a long time, even from when Mitt Romney, and when she was a big supporter of Romney in 2012, is that? And he was talking about self-deportation and this. I think there are ways to move towards that pre-1965 ethnic mix, because the ethnic mix is important because I believe the cultural ideals are part of one's ethnic background, right? So we were discussing Western ideals and whether it's possible for Western ideals to be protected and loved and cherished and forwarded by non-Western people, and even whether that would be a good thing, because non-Western people have their own contributions to human civilization too, because I mean they would have to shed their own thing to adopt these superior Western values, right? But you know, you may, some people I guess are more extreme in terms of the things they would say, kick everybody out and whatever, but I do think that there has been enough sort of illegality, like illegal immigration and stuff, that if you start to clamp down on it, it would have a big effect. If you were to have a moratorium and then allow some assimilation to occur with the existing population, as kind of occurred in the 19th century when you had all the people coming in from Eastern Europe, and then there was a sort of a moratorium. I think in 25 the legislation was passed, and there was a sort of emerging of a restated American ethos, I suppose, by the 50s, and then it was, you know, sort of disintegrated again with this wave. So that I was saying that's not illegitimate. I don't think it's illegitimate.
So you're just talking about a moratorium on immigration rather than maybe expelling illegal immigrants, but not kind of moving populations.
I mean, maybe there are some people who have these fantasies about moving population, but I don't think they're serious people, right? I don't think Richard Spencer even has argued that. Right? I don't think so.
I think he's been very cagey about exactly what it is that he proposes as Kurt Doolittle. I mean, these guys make me very nervous, because I do think that they are fundamentally hostile to non-white people, and even though they say they're not, but I don't believe them. I don't believe them based on the ways that I've seen them behave in conversation with other people. You say that, you know, that democracy is about conversation.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's a couplet by that great cultural nationalist William Butler Yeats, out of Ireland I have come, great hatred, little room, and the most intimate hatreds are between people who know each other very well.
That's correct.
One of the things that melting pots facilitate is maybe a little element of impersonality coming into political conversations that allows them to be, less vicious and to be things that don't necessarily divide families down the middle. Although I'm not sure that that's true.
No, you're right. I mean, because, although I talk about the virtues of living in a small society and all that, I mean, I have to get out at least once a year as well, because it'll stifle you, so there's always this kind of, it's sort of like, I think in Brave New World, wasn't there, these two sort of societies where you kind of go back and forth between, and definitely there's a, what's his name now? There's a British science fiction writer from the 20s who I just totally love. John, one of his books. Odd John, First and Last Man. Olaf Stapledon. He's hardly known. He is brilliant. He is brilliant, brilliant. And but he in his First and Last Man, when he talks about we're the first species of Homo sapiens, and there's and he talks about the 18 species that follow, and it's like a billion-year history of and we finally get to some means a 10,000-year lifespan is ideal. Immortality was tried and failed, and people didn't like it, and that also you had to have some period where you were wild, some period where you were in civilization, and so I think we do need these things. We need our close family, but we also need to be anonymous for a while. So there are these things. So although I like living in these small societies, but I have to get the hell out every once in a while or else I'll go crazy. So it's and I love to go to big cities and stuff, but I don't want to live there. So it's kind of like we kind of have to keep going back, and I suppose personalities, some people will be drawn to one more than the other, but I guess there's not a single monolithic solution perhaps to anything. We need the variation and the rhythm.
And I do think that liberalism, for all its flaws, is the best system we have for accommodating the fact that we can't cope with monolithic systems, so that there's too much variation in human beings for us to be all governed according to the same set of values, and that liberalism is something that up to a point at least allows different value systems to coexist
within the same society. See, because this is one of the things, we had a debate here in Trinidad and Tobago recently where I kind of caused a stir, where the head of a Hindu organization here, and they have a lot of Hindu schools, did not allow a teacher, an OJT teacher, on-the-job training, who was Muslim, to wear her hijab in the school. And so there was an uproar, and I defended the decision because there are Muslim schools, and and they have their rules too. And interestingly, the Muslim schools were fine with the decision, but the sort of intellectual argument I made, it's not based on tit for tat or anything like that. But the intellectual argument is that if everybody does the same thing everywhere, then no place is different. Right?
That's true.
So you have to have a space that has its own culture, traditions, mores, whatever, and then another one, and that's how you preserve diversity, not by having everything be the same and everybody,
and it is true that in the kind of consumerist liberalism, where people define their difference by the things that they wear and the music that they listen to, that ultimately it ends up being a fairly homogeneous soup. And you're right that people need to be rooted in a tradition, But
That's right, and everything is 80% this and 20% that, or 40%. There has to be a place where you go where the 20% is a majority, and you get to actually see and learn about it more. So what I would counter with your argument about liberalism being the best solution is that when you have a variety of nations and cultures with their own traditions, travel becomes a way, because then you travel from one place to another, and that's how you experience. Because some societies are going to be fast moving, some societies are going to be technologically oriented, some are going to be more spiritually oriented, some are going to be, and as you travel and move from place to place, you expand your horizons, and maybe that's where the term "expand your horizons" come from. So a very literal thing about traveling, So there's that as well, or else you lose everything, and everything becomes the statistical average,
Yeah, that's true. I guess we agree more than we disagree.
I think so.
So maybe I could just ask you as a closing question what you're planning to do in the future. What are your plans for the next few years?
Well, this new podcast is exciting for me, and I'm really glad that it gives me an excuse to reach out to people who I've wanted to reach out, but I had no real reason to. So that's great. And but I do want to get active in politics again in Trinidad and Tobago, but I need to figure out a way to do it, which has always been the challenge I've been facing on how to do it and maintain my integrity and engage in the mainstream. So without rejecting it, because I want to engage in the mainstream, and maintain my integrity too. And I've been able to do it to a certain extent. And I mean, that's how I was an independent senator and so forth. But so that's something I would like to work on, because I want to bring all these things into our politics as well, So I mean, in fact, that's one of the reasons why I want to do this politics, because it's the same thing. I mean, so it's almost I'm almost contradicting myself, because what I'm going to say is that the debates in Trinidad and Tobago become so insular, so inward looking, and they're not placing it in a wider context. I want us to see our debates within a more global context, and to see how what we're talking about here is not just about this person and that person and whatever, but that this is actually there are underlying principles, and other peoples and societies are talking about it, and it makes it more productive than the kind of politics that we have. So I've always been a politically committed intellectual. It goes back to the New World thing, right? Because all these intellectuals were politically committed, and that kind of caused a schism, because some people went with some socialist parties, some people went with the mainstream left parties, and some people didn't having anything to do with that, and whatever. So it goes back to that. I do want to become more politically engaged again, because I had gone out of that. So that's something I'm looking to do.
Okay. Okay. Well, maybe we'll leave it there. Thank you very much. That was an epic conversation. And
thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm glad to have gotten to know you during this process, as both of us are setting up our podcast. And I look forward to both of our podcasts growing.
Yeah. Okay. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Take care, John.
Bye.
Bye.